tangent.
I like it.
Because as I've gotten older, I feel like I'm becoming like Grandpa Simpson. Like I just have like random stories that are pointless. And so I was doing this interview, and in the interview we were talking about corporate iconography. You know, like IBM logo, Apple logo, and by the way, the sound man in me is saying that it's just on the edge of feeding back. Is
I
it?
agree, yes.
So we're doing this interview talking about corporate iconography and how it has almost like powerful fascistic qualities. And so we said something like, I said, oh, you know, a lot of this corporate iconography is sort of like powerful and almost fascistic, and it's, you know, like it's graphics. And then and I said, and a lot of it really looks kind of cool. And so the magazine, their poll quote was, Moby, fascism looks cool. So I'm just saying, like, as long as you don't accuse me of being a fascist, that's where my bar is set for rude.
Do you guys have that? No fascism. You know, there's another famous kind of thing that happened similar to that. We should get some up here for you to put that on. But David Bowie, remember there's a famous photo of him waving, and it looked like he was doing the Nazi salute, and he got in a lot of trouble for that too, because it was in his thin white Duke era when he kind of had that, he was hanging out in Germany and all that kind of thing. So, and now we know that he has that in common with David Bowie, fascism. You heard it here first. All right. So I was telling you backstage, basically what we do, you know, this is a class. We're going to talk about kind of your life and your career and some of the decisions you've made and some of the things that happened to make you make a decision. So hopefully these students here that are going to continue their own path and follow through might learn from your wise or sometimes unwise ways. And so I'm just going to start at the beginning, because the first thing I always like to know is, you know, when you were growing up, did you take any kind of formal lessons? Was music something that you were interested in? Did your parents or your mom, was she like, hey, you have to take piano lessons, or was it something you were drawn to?
Well, and is it about to feedback? Does that ring?
I don't.
No?
I think that's
okay.
Air conditioner, maybe.
Okay. No, there's a little ring there. Is it the monitors? Are these monitors on? Maybe. Okay, sorry. I used to install sound systems and was a sound man for a long time. So I'm just paranoid about like that edge of feedback.
Can you guys fix that?
So basically my mom was a painter and she also played piano. Everyone in my family had multiple sort of like creative outlets and disciplines. Like my uncle played guitar, recorder, and he was also a photographer for the New York Times. My grandmother was a watercolor painter, and she also taught classical composition. So, and no one had commercial success with their art, but it was just expected that everyone in our family did something creative. So, as I was growing up, there were tons of instruments lying around, and my mother had a painting studio that she shared with the band, so they had their equipment there. So I would go hang out with her in her painting studio, which might sound a lot more sort of bohemian and idealistic than it was. It wasn't very glamorous. It was basically, we couldn't afford childcare, so I would go like hang out in this
with the band, yeah.
Well, this would be during the day. Like she had the studio during the day, and the band had it at night. But I would then use all the band's equipment. Like, so I sort of taught myself how to play drums, and then I started studying guitar when I was around 10 years old. And I had this guitar teacher. He played in a heavy metal band, but he loved any type of music that was complicated. So he loved jazz fusion, and he loved classical music. So he gave me this very idiosyncratic musical education that involved like transcribing Van Halen guitar solos, listening to really bad jazz fusion, playing Bach cantatas, studying arcane music theory and scales that have Greek names that I don't even remember. Phrygian. And so yes, I did have this very unconventional, idiosyncratic, but oddly formal musical background. And then when I was 13 or 14, I got into punk rock, and I broke my guitar teacher's heart. Because all he wanted was for me to be like a virtuoso guitar player, playing super crazy, complicated stuff, and instead I wanted to play Clash songs.
Yeah, 3 chords and
yeah. And it literally, like, you just see like the sadness in his eyes. He's like, don't you want, we could transcribe Stormy Monday, but in, you know, C sharp minor. And I'm like, or we could just play a Ramones song.
Yeah. I can see why that would be disappointing to a teacher. Okay, I'm scared. We kind of know what we're doing here. It's okay. So, but what is that? Oh, I see. I like that.
It's actually Wayne Coyne under.
I wouldn't be surprised, actually. Is Wayne out there? Not yet.
You know, he texted me when I landed. I think he's here.
Where are you? Yeah, they were rehearsing tonight. Well, I mean, okay, so the punk rock thing, but before that, you know, you were in a Beatles cover band, right?
Well, musically, so from the time I was, let's say, 12 until 19, I played bass in a reggae band. I played guitar in a really bad rock cover band with the worst junior high school cover band name ever. We were called Image. And it's amazing how bad we were. And we picked, like, not amazing bands, and then did slightly obscure songs from not good bands. Like Steve Miller Band, we did a Steve Miller Band cover song, and they had some great songs. We did Swing Time. You know, it's their worst song, hands down. So it was just terrible. But then played guitar in a hardcore punk rock band, played jazz guitar, played drums in a punk rock band. I just sort of played with anyone.
Okay, so let's put it in perspective. You were born in 1965.
Sadly, yes.
So I was September 5th. You're September 11th. So we look so much alike too. So you can tell we're the same age. But reading, you know, before you came here, I read a lot of interviews and I watch the documentaries and all that kind of stuff, so I know what to talk to you about. But it was interesting to me just because of our ages, the similarities of the music that we were attracted to, I think, simultaneously, you know, that kind of thing. Because the Beatles were very important to me very young. And then, like you, I discovered punk rock, you know, and it just meant so much and you know, shaped the view of how I paid attention to music afterwards. And I kind of wonder sometimes if someone starts out, you know, with the Beatles and then turns into punk rock, this melody, is that something that always stays with you, that importance? Because I think that's what the Beatles were all about, you know. And do you think that those early influences of, what was it, C.W. McCoy Convoy was a single, and not that there's much melody to that, he's mostly talking, but the Beatles and what was your first concert? I remember
my first concert, well, my mom dated a lot of musicians, so my first concert would have been maybe her boyfriend, Bob, who played pedal steel in a country band when I was like 7 years old. And not to malign my mom or her parenting, but I would sort of like stay in the bar. Like taking your 7-year-old to a bar is fantastic parenting. And then I would go sleep in the car in the parking lot. So those were my first concerts, were going to bars when I was 7. And then when I was 12, I went to go see Yes at Madison Square Garden. Wow. And I didn't know any of their music. And they played for 3 hours. And our seats were at the way back of Madison Square Garden, and I loved every minute of it because it was a Thursday night, and it was a school night, and I was in New York City, and people were smoking pot around me. And I thought I was the coolest person in the world. And I even bought a T-shirt, like a bootleg T-shirt on the street, and the next day I wore my T-shirt, and I was in 8th grade, and the kid in 9th grade saw me walking down the hall with my Yes t-shirt, and he said, cool t-shirt. I was like, that, still to this day, is probably like the coolest I've ever felt.
Music is a great thing, it does that, you know. I love that. I saw that on your Alito thing, that was your first concert. And mine was Cheap Trick, Dream Tour. That was a good one too. But, so, in school though, did you take any classes? You know, I know you were taking the private lessons, but did you do anything in school?
I tried. When I went to university, and I was a philosophy major, and I tried taking some more sort of like structured classical composition classes, and it just didn't work for me because it was so academic, and I realized that with a lot of more academic music, like their criteria for music was purely academic, and it had nothing, like my criteria for music is how does it make me, how do I respond to it emotionally? And most people in the world of academics and music would just discount that as criteria, like emotion. Why would you care? Like emotion is too subjective. You can't teach emotion. You can't quantify emotion. But to me, that's 99.999% of what attracts me to music is my own subjective emotional response to it.
Right.
And so, and I took one class in experimental, like 12-tone, early 20th century experimental classical music, and some of it was quite interesting. Like I still appreciate, but I appreciate it more on a theoretical level. Like, no one wants to listen to Stockhausen.
Right.
It's nice to talk about. It's nice to reference. You sound smart. You know, like in the olden days, if you had a Stockhausen record in your record collection, and like a nerdy girl came over to your house and saw the Stockhausen record and said, "Oh, Stockhausen," you'd be like, "Wow, I'm so glad I bought that Stockhausen record that I've never ever going to listen to." Kind of like telling people you're a philosophy major, immediately they think you're smart. I was a shitty philosophy major. Like I was just like C minuses across the board. But you go to a cocktail party and you say I was a philosophy major. Like, wow, he must be smart. I thought I could just be lying. Wow.
So, okay. So when were the college thing? I didn't know you went to college. That's interesting. So
I didn't graduate.
You did?
I went a lot.
Where'd you go to school?
University of Connecticut.
All right, so you were still in Connecticut. It was before you moved to New York.
And then the State University of New York at Purchase. UConn it's an agricultural school, and all I wanted to do was be in New York City, and instead I was like in the middle of fields, and it was so depressing. And then I went to SUNY Purchase, which is this weird performing arts school. All sorts of weird artists have come out of there.
Right. So was this when you started doing your first recordings with bands in this kind of era? This would have been the late 80s, early 90s, I'm guessing?
Well, the first recordings I did, I remember the first recording I ever made was I borrowed my grandfather's cassette recorder and I recorded my mom chopping cucumbers. That was my introduction to the world of recording.
Have you sampled that later on?
I can't find the cassette. And then in high school, my punk rock band, we made a couple of singles. We were called the Vatican Commandos. And I mean, we had no idea what we were doing. So it was like a band in a room with a microphone. And the recordings actually are kind of interesting.
Is that the one you wrote?
Oh, that might be us or not. I ended up leaving the band in 1983, so that might have been after I left. I don't know. But those were all bands that we toured with and were friends with. And then I started a new wave band because I really wanted to be Morrissey and Robert Smith. And there was a local recording studio, and we would basically, my friends in the band and I would we were handymans for the studio, and instead of being paid, we could record there. But I didn't really learn anything about recording because we were the engineer was annoyed with us, and I didn't like the way the recording sounded, but I had no idea why I didn't like the, I was like, he knows what he's doing, why don't the recordings sound good? And it created almost like a cognitive dissonance. I was like, he's the expert, he knows what he's doing and I know nothing, so am I allowed to have this opinion? Right. You know, when I disagree with the expert and I think terrible, but I don't have the language to say what I don't like about them.
Right.
And so then I spent the next few years sort of like building my own home studio with a 4-track, a Casio keyboard, a couple of SM57s, and trying to figure out how to record things.
So when you started recording like that, was that the point where when you had moved to New York? I mean, what made you want to move to New York in the first place?
So basically, I was living at home with my mom, and she got remarried, and when you're 20 years old, living at home with your mom and her new husband, like, it's not awesome. So I moved out, and I rented a space in an abandoned factory in a crack neighborhood. It was $50 a month. You'd pay the security guard $50 a month, and he would sort of look the other way. And I had no running water, no bathroom, and I loved it because it was free electricity. Granted, like, you would hear people getting shot, you'd hear, you know, it was really nasty, but like, it was free electricity, and it was amazing.
Well, it was funny because there's a documentary on the DVD that's kind of the greatest hits that go DVD, and that was my question about you living in there, because he breaks into it in this documentary, he goes back, and I was like, oh, this is where I lived, it looks the same. And my only thought was like, how did he have electricity? So it was just on.
They'd never turned off the electricity in the building. So the bathroom was about 200 yards down the hallway. And it was this old 19th century factory that now is fancy condos, but at the time was just abandoned. And I mean, it was very unpleasant. But I was making $8,000 a year, so $50 a month rent was what I could afford. And then to your New York City question, this was in Stamford, Connecticut.
Right.
And my best friend at the time was a painter. And we both knew that we wanted to like live in New York because it was really hard to have this was pre-internet, this was 1987, 88. It was really hard to have a viable career as a musician or a painter and not be in a big city. And New York was 40 minutes away from us, but still it was like, you couldn't go to a record company in New York and say, oh, by the way, I live in the suburbs. They would just immediately discount you. Or I couldn't get a job as a DJ somewhere saying, oh, I can take the train in from, you know, I can take the commuter train in from Connecticut. That it didn't enhance your cool status.
But you had started DJing before you left Connecticut. That was how you're making $8,000 to live.
A year, yeah. I was playing 6 or 7 hours a night, 3 or 4 nights a week, getting paid about $75 a night.
Wow.
And occasionally, the glamour of DJing in the 80s, to supplement my income, I would DJ parties and weddings. My favorite wedding was a wedding where the bride and groom, their family didn't want them to get married, so the family refused to pay for the wedding. As a result, the bride and groom couldn't afford to rent real equipment, so I DJ'd with cassette decks. And they gave me their favorite cassettes. So
I was about to say, did you just make a mixtape and play?
No, I'd have to cue them up and like pause, like, anyway you want it, that's the way you need it, and pause. And they're like, don't you forget about me.
The bootleg will be available after this. Moby sings the 80s. I love it. So, DJ, moved to New York. Well, first off, there's a comment you made, and I think this applies to you early on in an interview in Time, I think. Maybe it's not, I don't know. But you talked about how you're obsessive compulsive with music, and that was that was important. And I was curious when you feel like that started for you, that obsessive compulsiveness. Was this something that when you were like 12 and you bought that first 45, you just were like, I just want to have that same experience again of loving music, or what was that for you?
Suddenly I feel like I'm at an AA meeting. Well, I remember when I had my first record, and I knew instant.
It could be like that.
It actually was like that. I was 3.5 years old. I was in the car with my mom, and Proud Mary by Creedence Clearwater Revival came on, and I literally refused to get out of the car. We'd stopped at the beginning of the song, and I refused to get out of the car until the song was done. And I sat there like I was transfixed by this song. And then the first record I ever bought that you mentioned earlier, Convoy by C.W. McCall, which is actually a weird 1970s hybrid of hip-hop and country. Like the choruses are country, and the verses are this weird CB radio, almost hip-hop, you know.
Isn't he Mannheim Steamroller now?
C.W. McCall?
His real name is something else. And
or maybe he's like transgender, it's RuPaul.
I don't think it went that far, but yeah.
So I got my first 7-inch Convoy by C.W. McCall, and I listened to it 40 times in a row. It ended, I picked up the needle, put it down, ended, picked up the needle. At that point, my mom should have given me like the number for a rehab. And just said, clearly you have an addictive personality.
Yeah. And do you think, though, that that's helped you?
Yeah, I think it's the only reason I have a career as a musician. It's literally the only thing that has sustained me and driven me is that idea, or the goal of creating music that somehow affects me as strongly as those first experiences. I mean, it's kind of like chasing the dragon.
Yeah.
You know, but it's every day when I go into my studio, it's that excitement. It's like you have your tabula rasa. It's one of the beautiful things about music. You have nothing, but you have sort of frameworks that you can work within, and you never know what you're going to make. And a lot of times, you end up making stuff that doesn't resonate with you emotionally, but when you do, it's such an amazing feeling. Right? So, I mean, that's my life's work. Like everything else is really ancillary to that.
So you're living in New York. You've been doing your DJ gigs. I mean, when you first got there, were you going? Obviously, you wanted to have some kind of career with music. That was when you were. Were you leaning towards the DJ and the dance culture, or were you leaning towards I want to be in a band, or did it not matter?
Well, it's funny because I managed to alienate almost all the musicians around me consistently throughout my life. So, as I said, when I was like 10 to 13, my guitar teacher wanted me to play complicated music, and so I tried like playing free jazz with other 12-year-olds who studied with this same guitar player. And then I alienated all of them by joining a punk rock band. And then I alienated all my punk rock friends by loving the Smiths and the Cure. And then I alienated all my indie rock fans by loving hip-hop. And then I alienated all my hip-hop friends by loving house music. So by the early 90s, I was firmly ensconced in the world of house music and techno, which was ironic because at the time I was sober and I had a classical music background, or among DJs who were out of their mind on drugs. But I just loved the reductive simplicity of electronic music. And then I alienated all of them in the mid-90s by making a sort of like industrial punk rock record.
We'll get there.
Okay.
So, I love how you just never stopped. You were always driven, and the small things were. It seemed, at least reading about your career and watching the documentaries and stuff, that the small successes kept leading you on to the next thing. You just never gave up and kept moving forward. And these are the things that I think are important for everyone here to hear and realize. That sometimes it's that DJ situation when you're living in Connecticut, making $8,000 a year, that created the mindset like, okay, well, I can take it to the next level and try to move to New York or whatever. What was the thing that took you to the next level? When you moved to New York, you were just kind of starting out. I know you started DJing really on a more regular basis. Where was that first place, and how did that happen?
Well, basically, so I would spend my days writing music and making demo cassettes and going to every record label in New York over and over again. You know, like walking through the rain with my little bag of cassettes, going to all these indie labels, and none of them were interested. But I kept showing up, and then I met this guy who was starting a label, and I gave him a cassette, and he said, "Oh, I'd like to sign you to my label. And I was so excited, I couldn't believe it. I was like, I'm gonna have a record contract. To put it in perspective, when I signed with him, the label didn't have a name, had never put out a record, and didn't have employees or an office.
So, what was on the piece of paper you signed?
It was like a DBA. Like the two guys who were starting it saying like DBA quote record company.
Right, right. And you were comfortable with that?
I had never expected to have a record contract. I would have signed anyone, like if a homeless guy had come up to me with like a beer can and a Sharpie and just sign my contract. Great.
So, and that would have been what became ACMUCO Records.
Yeah.
And what was the idea? Were you going to release music as a kind of electronic musician, or was it your punk band?
Oh, just DJ.
Just DJ.
100% dance music. They wanted to be a DJ label. I was a raver. They were ravers. And then for the first couple of years, I was their only artist, but they wanted to make it seem like they had multiple artists. So I worked under a lot of different names. And then in 1991 or 92, they put out a compilation album. And I'm not kidding, it's called Instinct Dance, and I'm literally the only artist on it.
So what were some of the names there?
It was Voodoo Child, UHF, Mindstorm, Barracuda. Basically, a lot of these are like classic rock songs. Like Voodoo Child, Barracuda. I looked through my record collection, like, oh, Heart, Barracuda, that's a cool name or something.
So you were putting these records out, and you know, did you start having a regular gig DJing? Were there several places you played, or was there the first one that really kind of connected for you?
I got so lucky. You know that old expression like fortune favors the well-prepared? I would say fortune favors the clueless and the persistent. Because I didn't know how to do anything. So the same way I was bringing cassettes to record companies, I was bringing cassettes to nightclubs to see if I could get a job DJing. This was New York in the late 80s. It was so nepotistic. There were like 6 DJs who worked everywhere. But I didn't know that, so I kept giving cassettes, and I found this one nightclub called Mars, which was like 6 stories tall and amazing. And I gave a cassette to the man who was booking the DJs. And he had just moved to New York from Japan, and he didn't know that he was supposed to hire these 6 DJs. So actually he listened to my cassette and called me and offered me a job. And I just couldn't believe it. I was like, I have a job DJing in New York City. Like, it was in the basement, it was $100 a night, but still, like, it was very, very exciting.
That's right. And then, so did you, because the DJ world's, managing Flame Lips as always, punk rock kind of band. You did a different kind of thing. So doing my research on you was always really interesting because obviously there's this strange kind of parallel of that era of the punk rock bands and kind of what was going on, and then what was the growth of the dance culture and all of that. So, you get a bigger audience. Did you have an audience that would move with you, or did you move to different venues? How did that kind of work?
It was, the rave scene was exploding. This was 1991, 92, 93, and it was amazing. And also, so the first single that I put out